We are thinking about, I guess, a heavy topic, a topic of mental ill health, and whether the gospel, the good news about Jesus, has anything to say into this profound area in which all of us struggle. They say that 1 in 4 of us will experience some kind of mental health struggle in any given year. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? And that quarter of the population will change year on year on year. But if you are not affected personally by mental ill health at the moment, there's a good chance you will be at some stage in your life. And if you're very blessed not to have to struggle in that way, there will be people in your family, people who are very close to you, who struggle in this area. Is there any good news that we can bring into this area? Because so often, even the people who want to try to help end up being the greatest hindrances when it comes to this area of life. And so it's very important that we understand this area of life, and very important that we have empathy in this area of life. And I think there is not a cure in this area of life, but there is a measure of healing that can come in this area, a measure of help that can come, a measure of light that shines into dark places. And we're going to be pressing into what that might be. To give you some more statistics, not just 1 in 4 will experience a mental health problem in any given year. 3/4 of those sufferers will receive no treatment, no medical clinical treatment in that year. The cost of mental health problems in this country alone is estimated to be about £100 billion. That's about 4.5% of GDP. It is the leading cause of sickness absence in this country. The leading cause of sickness absence is depression and anxiety in this country. 70 million days are lost from work each year. And then globally, mental health problems constitute the largest single source of world economic burden. That's £1.6 trillion lost every year. That is more of a burden than cardiovascular disease, chronic respiratory disease, cancer, and diabetes put together. So, this is a big problem, isn't it? This is a big issue in life. Some of the leading causes of mental ill health are depression and anxiety. Some of the most deadly eating disorders, also schizophrenia, in terms of suicidality. So why am I talking about this issue? Well, I guess I've been in a counsellor's office many times in my life. Every single member of my immediate family has at some point struggled with mental ill health. As a minister of the gospel, I'm an Anglican minister, and very interestingly, sort of as bishops lay their hands on you and commission you as a minister of the gospel, they charge you with the cure of souls, which is very interesting, because you might know that the Greek word for soul is the word psyche. So actually, a gospel minister is charged with the cure of psyches. The word psychiatrist means a soul doctor. A psychiatrist is a soul doctor. And in the ministry, we deal very much with the area of the soul, the area of people's pain in life. So from a professional point of view, it's an area of deep concern for me. But also more close to home. Some of you know my wife's story, Emma. We've got some of her books here at the back. We'll watch a video with her in a second. But she tells her story of dealing with life-threatening anorexia, both as a teenager and again as an adult, in A New Name. So that was a book from a few years ago that's really helped people. And she also writes about mental health issues here in A New Day, which is a book that's just out. And dealing with all sorts of issues, including anxiety, including depression, including self-harm, including OCD, eating disorders, that sort of thing. So it's an area that's very close to home for us as a couple. And do check out these books later. Just £5, which is a good deal for those books. Perhaps we can look at a video where Emma discusses some of her struggles, in particular with anorexia, and then we'll broaden out our discussion to think about how we can help other people who are struggling with mental health.
I think this is the closest I'm ever going to get to being a rock star. I just want to savour the moment. My name is Glen Scrivener, and twice in my life I've had anorexia, which nearly killed me. But on both occasions, as a child and as an adult, I would have said that I was Christian. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that when I was about 13 and became a Christian, that's when some of my problems actually started. Now, it's funny because you hear about people with their testimonies sometimes, and you think, well, that's when it all goes right. Your skin improves and you get a boyfriend and all the rest, but not for me. And I think it's got a large part to do with the kind of God that I found. The God who actually isn't the real God. It wasn't Jesus, but a God that I kind of made in my own image. And this God was a God who was all about rules. He was all about performance. And I figured that he kind of got me saved, but then from then on in, the rest was up to me. And in some ways, you might think that's bad news, but I'm one of life's good girls, so it sounded to me like that was actually good news instead. I like rules. In our family, I have a younger brother and sister, and we've got a saying, which is that my sister got the brains, my brother got the looks, and I got the morals. So I came off pretty bad on that one. The problem was that no matter how good I tried to be, whether, in looks or in grades or in morals or whatever, it turned out that good was never good enough. So what happens when a good girl goes off the rails? Well, I turned to drugs, but not drugs as you'd hear it in a conventional sense. My drug was being thin. My drug was anorexia. And for me, it wasn't about being size 0. I didn't look in the mirror and think I was fat. I didn't want to be like Kate Moss or anything like that. For me, fat was all about mess. I felt like there was too much of me. I was too intense. I didn't look the way I was meant to look. I didn't know how to say things the right way. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know where I belonged. Whatever I did, I felt it just wasn't enough. And so being thin was a way for me to clean up the mess. I felt like I was red wine spilled from the white carpet. And whenever I tried and got thinner, it was like I was stainless steel. It was like I was cleaning myself up. The old me wasn't working, so I decided I'd make a new one. But the problem was that even though I thought I was in control of my eating disorder, it was controlling me. As a child, I got help. I got very sick, but we got counselling and I put weight back on again. But on the inside, the issues were all still there. So, what does a good girl do? Well, I threw myself into Christian ministry. And 7 years ago, if you'd seen me, you'd have seen someone who was married to a vicar, studying at Bible college, writing children's ministry. We were dynamos, we were going to really go far. But on the inside, I was scared, and the old patterns were starting up again. I was scared of being a vicar's wife. I don't know how to do a tray bake. I'm not a very welcoming and open person. I was scared of it all. Didn't know how to handle it. So the old pattern started again. And it wasn't glamorous. I got really, really sick. There wasn't my parents to feed me spaghetti this time round. So my hair fell out and my organs started shutting down. My nails turned black. I remember trying to get up to go to the loo one day, but I didn't make it. Just lay there and put myself on the floor. And that's sort of the face of an eating disorder. It's not glamorous. It's really, really horrible. It's a bad place to be. We were waiting for me to die. It seemed like no one could help. But somebody else died first. That was my grandmother. I was very, very close to her. And she was in Ireland. I was over in England. But I was too sick to make it to the funeral. And that night, I looked into the fire and I cried out to God. And Lord, I said, look, I've been running from you. I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm doing. But if you'll take what's left, will you have it? And the God that I met there was no thunderbolt or lightning or anything like that. I opened up my Bible and I met Jesus. Not the God I thought I knew, but the God who knew me. And funnily enough, I read about him in the book of Revelation. There were 2 pictures of him I saw there. One was a lion, blazing, in control, eyes like fire, unstoppable, more intense than I could ever be. But the other picture was a lamb, someone who died for me, someone who was broken and who understood what it was to be weak. And it was those two things, his power and his majesty and his control, but also his weakness. And it was his kindness that finally brought me to my knees. You see, I was wrong about God. I thought he was about rules. I thought he was about masks. But he didn't want my mask. He didn't want my apologies. He didn't want me to do better. He didn't want my performance. Jesus wanted me. And I knew that I was broken. I've known that all my life. I didn't know that I was loved. I didn't know that I was utterly accepted. And when I knew this, it changed everything. That began for me the process of a long recovery. And it takes years. It is a process. It's hard. You go backwards, you go forwards. It's not simple. But this is where I started. You see, I spent my life trying to find the God that I could never please. But in the darker place, it actually turned out that Jesus had found me.
So like I say, do check out A New Name. That's where Emma talks us through that story at greater length, and she's a brilliant writer, far, far better than me. I have to give away my books for people even take them. It'll get to the point I'll have to pay people soon. But this is well worth it. A New Name, and then A New Day is about walking through some of those recovery issues. But yeah, great books for you to check out. So who are we going to turn to for help when it comes to walking through these valleys of the shadow of death? Who's going to help us navigate our path? Stephen Fry, that's right. I think Stephen Fry might provide some help. You might know that very, very publicly Stephen Fry has had all sorts of struggles, especially with bipolar disorder, where you have times of mania and times of real depression. And actually, perhaps now would be a good time to have a look at Stephen Fry. Not a Christian, in fact, quite anti-Christian, quite anti the idea that there might be some kind of God, actually. But he's very open and honest about his own struggles, especially with the low times and depression. And I thought, as we watch this, can we be thinking, what are the words and phrases and images he uses to describe depression? Can you be looking out for words, images, impressions by which he describes his struggle with depression? And then can you think about what it is that he finds helpful? Think about that. How does he describe the problem? What does he point to as the solutions? Because after we watch this, we might just break up into twos and threes to chat those two things together. So how does he describe the problem? What does he point to as some of the helps? Let's have a look.
Comes a time when the blankness of future is so extreme, it's such a black wall of nothingness. Not even of bad things. It's not like it's a cave full of monsters that you're afraid of entering the future. It is just a nothingness. The néant, as the French would say, la vide, the void, the emptiness. And it is just horrible.
The actor, writer and presenter Stephen Fry can also see the beginnings of his bipolar disorder in his teenage years.
It came as quite a shock to me to realise that the feelings of suicidal thoughts that I had were actually rare, that these were not the norm. Many other feelings I had were perfectly normal, but the feeling of wishing my life would end and trying to do something about it, which I did from, I guess, 17, 18 a few times, that I discovered was not usual. And I suppose that is as good a time to date him from as again.
In the late 1990s, Stephen Fry was appearing in a West End play when he went into a terrible depression. One night he sat in his car in the garage on the verge of suicide. In despair and confusion, he left instead on a ferry for France.
I saw these rows of newspaper headlines and fears for pride type thing. And I stared at it in complete disbelief. I mean, it was absolutely staggering. I can't believe I make people worry so much.
After realising he'd inadvertently prompted an international search for his whereabouts, he returned to London and admitted himself to hospital. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder.
It's horrible to contemplate a futureless future, if that isn't too impossible. And so you just want to step out of it, to step out of the whole race, the whole business. The monstrosity of being alive overwhelms you.
In 2006, Stephen Fry was filming a documentary about his mental health struggles when he fell into a bleak depression.
For the last few days, I've been feeling increasingly depressed. Very sort of black state at the moment, and would love to be somewhere else other than here, frankly. I'm fully aware of a very awful person to be with. I find it difficult to meet people's eyes. I find it very difficult to connect to people. I find it very... I just want to be alone, frankly. I'm just praying a little past, basically, because it's very irritating, and I hate myself for it. I mean, I never thought that I hear voices, but I do. I do have a voice telling me I'm a complete all the time in my head. Usually when I feel like this, I hide away. I can't this time. For me, that numbing kind of depression comes 3 to 4 times a year and lasts a week to 10 days. I spend the time in the house, staring at the ceiling.
Severe mood swings are still a central feature of Stephen Fry's life.
Mood to me is like weather. If it's raining, it's no good saying it isn't raining. It is real. You know, that water is actually falling from the sky. It can take you by surprise because it can happen in a sort of crossover, a transitional phase of moods when you're actually quite up. And you can't really make sense of it because it's as if the clouds are coming in, but you feel good. So you think, this is really weird. Well, what's that about? And then, you know, and it might be 2 days later. It's just got heavier and heavier. The best talking therapy is really listening therapy. It's not talking therapy at all. It's a room which allows you to talk to yourself. And most of the talking is done by the client or patient. And then just occasionally it's the usual thing of... you know, you're sort of saying, I know I shouldn't do it. And they go, why do you say you shouldn't? You know, and then you say, well, yeah, no, you're right. Oh, yes, no. You know, and it's bits of that. The thing that keeps one living is a sense of future, that there will be a tomorrow, and tomorrow I'm going to do this, and then the day after I'm going to do that. Not that any of these things have a particular logical purpose or a convincing reason to exist, but they somehow keep one going. In the words of Dorothy Parker, a great wit and writer and poet, you might as well live. It's her poem she wrote.
Okay, shall we just split up into groups? If you don't want to talk or share, that's absolutely fine, you can listen. But why don't we think about those two things just briefly? How does Stephen Fry define the problem? What are some of the words and phrases and issues that he raises in terms of what the problem is? And what does he point to as some of the helps? Should we do that? Let's break up into groups and we'll feedback in a couple of minutes. Words that he used.
Void. Sort of darkness and nothingness.
Yeah.
Earth core of nothingness is there, I think. There's nothing ahead of him, nothing in the future.
Right. Yep. Black wall of nothingness, void. Yeah. Numbness. Yeah. Yeah, what does it feel like, actually? I can't even raise myself up to the stage of feeling something about this. Yeah. Futureless future. That was one of the things, wasn't it? Futureless future. And what were some of the things he pointed to as helps along the way?
Talking about it and having someone listen to you.
Yeah, talking it out, having someone listen. And that someone didn't always kind of fix the problem, did they? They just sort of, maybe every now and again said, why do you say shouldn't? Yes, having someone to talk it out with. Yeah.
He seemed to recognise that there was a pattern to it, that
Right.
he said, fortnights a year, probably 10 days. So
Right.
he's learned how it works.
Yes.
Which helps him probably.
Yeah. Yes. And I'm sure that was hard won. I'm sure that came after a long experience with it to actually feel out the shape of it. Yeah.
He didn't say who he was going to pray to, but he said, I pray.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
He talked about having some sort of future, even if it's, I'm going to do this tomorrow and then the next day,
Mm-hmm.
even if that doesn't mean anything, ultimately it
Yes.
helps.
Yes. Yes. Even if there's no convincing reason for you to think that there's a future, you better think that there's a future. Yeah, so he needs a sense of future. Yeah. Yeah, I think I distilled those three things as well. But being a preacher, I've made them all begin with the same letter. So I think the three things he was pointing to were really the fact of the feelings. So I get double F with that one. Yeah, 10 points, 10 preacher points for that one. There's the fact of the feelings. Remember, he said it's like rain. You know, there's no use in shaking your fist at the water that's coming down. It's just rain. It's happening. It's going to happen. You need to accept that it's happening, and you need to kind of know the shape of it. It's going to fall. The rain is going to fall. You need to acknowledge the fact of those feelings. You also need friendship in the midst of it, somebody to talk it out with. And you need a future, that sense of future. And what I find fascinating is that though I completely agree with those three helps. We need to acknowledge the fact of the feelings, we need a friend through the suffering, and we need a sense of future. And I just want to spend the remainder of our time showing how from the Bible that is exactly what we are offered. And I think that actually the Bible gives us foundations for believing in all those three things. Foundations that are far better than Stephen Fry's own atheism. You'll notice that Stephen Fry said he has no convincing reason to believe in a future, and yet you've got to believe in a future. He doesn't believe in a God to pray to, but he can't stop himself praying. Wouldn't it be amazing if there was a help to get you through these kinds of struggles? And that actually, what if Christianity makes you more earthed, more rationally able to handle these struggles in life? Because I think Stephen Fry actually, he has to move away from what he knows in order to help himself in his depression. He doesn't think that there's a God, but he finds himself praying. He doesn't think that there's a convincing reason to believe in a future, but he's got to believe in a convincing reason for the future. What if he didn't have to divorce himself? What if he didn't have to walk away from what he thinks he knows? What if walking into the truths of Christianity actually helped him with these three things? So let's just think about those three things in our remaining time. The fact of the feelings, friendship, and a sense of future. And the fact of the feelings is just all over the Bible. I don't know if you've picked up a Bible anytime recently, but you might know that right in the middle of our Bibles, there is a songbook. It's 150 songs. They're called Psalms. And the word psalm just means a hymn of praise. But what's fascinating about all these hymns of praise is that about 1 in 3 of them are psalms of lament, psalms of anguish, psalms talking about the darkness. 1 in 3. It's the most common kind of psalm that there is. A psalm that says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." That's what these songs are. So the Bible is constantly affirming the fact of the darkness. There's no point in actually limiting our understanding of these things. One of the Psalms that's perhaps the most bleak of them all is Psalm 88. And let me just read to you a few words from Psalm 88. And some of the images that this psalmist uses to speak about the darkness. He says, "I am overwhelmed with troubles and my life draws near to death. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like one without strength. I am set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave." And then he says to God, "You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths." It's almost this picture of being buried alive. He kind of feels like he's dead already. Here is the void, right? Here is the void, written by a man about 1000 BC. Here is a man struggling with the void, feeling like he's dead. He also feels like he's drowning. Here are some words from later on in the psalm. He says, "O Lord, all day long your terrors surround me like a flood. They have completely engulfed me." So he feels like he's dead. He feels like he's drowning. Do you ever feel like you're drowning? Life just comes up to your neck and you get on tiptoes and you try to breathe and it just goes over your head. You're engulfed. You're drowning in life. That's how the psalmist feels. Dead, drowning, and also deserted. The final line from Psalm 88. "God, you have taken from me friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest friend." It's this idea that I'm deserted, I'm abandoned, I'm all alone, my friends are not here. And my greatest friend is maybe the blackness of night. Maybe if I can get my head down on the pillow and manage to get to sleep, the sweet oblivion of death will just wipe the memory banks. And that's my greatest consolation. My greatest hope is to embrace the darkness. Darkness is my closest friend because all my other friends have deserted me. This is a feeling of such solitude and aloneness. So here is this 3,000-year-old spiritual journal. And it's all about struggles that we would identify as struggles with depression. I'm pretty sure if this psalmist went to their GP, they'd get a diagnosis of depression. I'm pretty sure, and if they didn't, they should go to their next GP, okay? I'm pretty certain they would get that kind of diagnosis. What's fascinating to me is of all the commentaries that people have written on the Psalms, for the last 3,000 years, people have been singing these Psalms and thinking about them, meditating on them. And I think probably the richest commentary on all the Psalms was written in the 19th century by a preacher called Charles Spurgeon. And he wrote this commentary on the Psalms called The Treasury of David. And I think it's the best commentary on the Psalms. And Charles Spurgeon struggled with depression throughout his life. And I think those two things are linked. I don't think it's an accident that a man who struggles with depression all through his life is actually able to unpack and understand the Psalms so richly. So here's what Spurgeon wrote. And when he wrote this, Sigmund Freud was 1 year old. Okay? So this is long before the birth of modern psychotherapy. Long before the birth of anything we sort of understand by modern psychotherapy. And yet Spurgeon really puts his finger on the issues to do with depression. The psalmist felt as if he were as utterly forgotten as those who are left to rot on the battlefield, as when a soldier mortally wounded bleeds unheeded amid the heaps of slain, and remains to his last expiring groan unpitied and unsuccoured. So did this psalmist sigh out his soul in loneliest sorrow, feeling as if even God himself had quite forgotten him. How low the spirits of good and brave men will sometimes sink. Under the influence of certain disorders, everything will wear a somber aspect, and the heart will dive into the profoundest deeps of misery. It is all very well for those who are in robust health and full of spirits to blame those whose lives are sicklied over with the pale cast of melancholy. But the evil is as real as a gaping wound, and all the more hard to bear because it lies so much in the region of the soul that to the inexperienced it appears to be a mere matter of fancy and diseased imagination. Reader, says Spurgeon, never ridicule the depressed. Their pain is real. Though much of the evil lies in the imagination, it is not imaginary. Amazing words, written 150 years ago. He goes on and he speaks about how so often when you're suffering with depression, you feel like you don't have the right to suffer with depression because you haven't broken a leg. You haven't got some physical diagnosis. You haven't been diagnosed with cancer or something. And so you feel like you have no right to be feeling the way that you're feeling. Spurgeon writes a really interesting corrective. He says, the mind can descend far lower than the body. The mind can descend far lower than the body. He's saying mental anguish can be far deeper than physical suffering. He says, for the mind, there are bottomless pits. Physically speaking, there's no such thing as a bottomless pit. Mentally, there totally is such a thing as a bottomless pit. He says the flesh can bear only a certain number of wounds and no more. But the soul can bleed in 10,000 ways and die over and over again each hour. Isn't that amazing? You know, if you bleed physically, at some stage you'll stop bleeding and you'll be dead. Mentally, you can bleed to death 10,000 times a day. So never feel like, well, because I don't have some physical diagnosis of some physical suffering, I have no right to feel in anguish or in pain. Mentally, there are such things as bottomless pits. So we need to acknowledge the fact of the feelings. And all throughout the Bible, it acknowledges the fact of the void, the fact of the darkness, the fact of the valley of the shadow of death. This is real. And it's important to acknowledge its reality. Secondly, Stephen Fry spoke about talking it out. And I've summarized that as friendship. We need a friend in these dark places. But we need a certain kind of friend, don't we? Not every kind of friend is helpful when it comes to suffering. And not every kind of word that is spoken to you is always a helpful word when you're walking through suffering, is it? So often friends just try to fix you, don't they? And there is a story all about that in the Bible. Perhaps the oldest part of the Bible that was ever written is this epic poem about Job. You heard about Job and Job's sufferings? We sometimes talk about going through the sufferings of Job. Here is a man who actually loses his family, he loses his wealth, he loses his health at a single stroke, right at the start of the book. And then for the next sort of 38 chapters, he is really wrestling with this suffering, and he sort of speaks out his soul, acknowledging the fact of the feelings. But one of the worst things that Job has to encounter in his suffering are his friends. They seem to do even more harm than the physical boils that are on his body. There are these friends who come, and for 1 week they just sit with Job in silence, and that's the best thing they ever do. They come and they sit with Job for a week. And then all the trouble starts when they open their mouth. And they just try to fix Job. And really their problem is they basically have this understanding that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, right? And it's kind of in the water, isn't it? We kind of have this idea, don't we, that you get what you deserve in life, right? We kind of have this understanding out there in the world that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. But if that's your mentality and you're trying to help someone who's suffering, what are you going to end up doing? You're going to end up blaming them for their suffering, aren't you? Well, bad things are happening to them. What's the cause of it? Well, they must have done something bad, right? And so throughout Job, you see these so-called friends who come and they give all this counsel and this advice. And they said, well, you must have done something really terrible, Job, to bring this on yourself. And actually they become tormentors. These friends actually end up becoming tormentors because they have exactly the wrong view of the world. As though good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. They end up tormenting him. And of course none of us here are as bad as Job's friends, except that we kind of do it to ourselves, don't we? If you're ever going through suffering, don't you start to think, it's probably me, isn't it? I'm probably the reason. I'm probably the fault. Now, obviously, there are physical things. If I end up having liver disease, well, maybe it's because I drank 10 pints a day during my youth, and maybe there are, physical causes to some things. But spiritually speaking, the Bible doesn't want to make you draw that straight line from that ill behavior led to that ill health. That's just not really the way the Bible speaks. So these friends, these Job's comforters, they're not the right kind of friends. Maybe we can look at another example of Job's comforters on here. This is an example that I came across a few years ago, and it's part tragic, part comic. It's about a guy who has hiccups, chronic hiccups, not like for an hour, but for year after year after year. And I want to see if you can identify what kind of comfort is being offered to this man after a while. Let's have a look.
This has been hiccuping, I think, every second since you sat down.
Well, yeah, I've been hiccuping every second since I woke up at 9 o'clock this morning.
And this has been going on for nearly 2 years.
Yeah, since February 2007. It's been pretty much every day.
And have you had bouts of this, like long bouts of hiccups before? Or this?
Well, I got a 2-week bout in September 2006, completely randomly, out of nowhere. Hiccups 2 weeks, and they stopped on their own, and then they came back 4 months later, in February. And then they've just happened ever since.
You're a bit thin, if I can say, Chris. Have you been really? I mean, it must be hard to keep food down.
Yeah,
Have you lost weight?
Yeah, I've lost weight, and I've not been keeping any food down recently. So doctors have been prescribing me on nutrient drinks, so I can just have liquid food.
And they can't find a solution to your problem. Because the hiccups, when your diaphragm gets
the wrong way, your diaphragm goes about spasm. Doctors don't even really know what the hiccups are. They know it's an irritation of the diaphragm, they know it's a spasm and things, but they don't know why we hiccup at all.
Right. Have you tried all the business of sticking your fingers in your ears and shoving your nose and drinking out the wrong side of the...
You wouldn't believe the amount of ways I've drunk water. I must have drunk every way you could drink water.
Yeah.
There's no other way you can drink water, but I haven't tried it.
Jennifer says, drink hot milk sprinkled with white pepper. You tried that?
No, I haven't tried that.
All right.
Sugar is another one. Take
I've tried
sugar.
Okay.
Yeah.
Haley in Newcastle.
Yeah, I've tried vinegar.
John Vinegar.
Yeah.
Haley in Newcastle says, hold your breath. You've done that. I count to 60 really quickly and then swallow.
I've got held my breath and swallowed, and there's been other tactics where you hold your breath and then you swallow and then you try and take more air in, don't let air, and keep on swallowing.
How do you sleep?
You don't.
He goes on, and Brenda from Birmingham says, have you tried lemon seed? Yes, I've tried. And on it goes, and on it goes. Just people trying to fix you, people trying to fix you. And this is a great problem when it comes to suffering, and a great problem when it comes to mental health issues as well. Just as hiccups are a great mystery to people, so the inner workings of the soul are a great mystery to people, and why people are suffering in certain ways is a great mystery, even to the greatest psychiatrists. And yet we want to come in, and we want to fix, and we want to fix, and we want to fix. Brene Brown is a psychologist in the States, and she gives this brilliant example of the difference between sympathy and empathy, and what true friendship looks like when someone is really suffering. And I think her example of how we can befriend people as they're going through dark times is really the way forward. Let's have a look at this.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space where someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. At least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
It's part of a longer... It's part of a longer lecture where she says, she compares the two different responses. You can say at least to somebody, or you can say me too. At least is a terrible response to someone suffering, Like she says, you've had the miscarriage, they say, well, at least you know you can get pregnant. Does that help anybody? Has that in the history of humankind ever helped anybody? No. Silver lining people like that just doesn't work. What really works is me too. Me too. And the beautiful thing about the Bible is Jesus is not the kind of God who stays up in heaven, peers down, and says, at least. He's not the kind of God who just says, worse things happen at sea, and lightning doesn't strike twice, and all these other, rubbish comforts that never comfort anybody. He's not the God who says, at least, at least. He's the God who climbs down into the pit and says, me too. The beautiful thing about Jesus, Christians love Jesus because he has befriended us. He has not just stood from a distance and told us clear instructions about how to climb to him. He has come down into the pit. And one of the things Jesus did was he would have prayed through the Psalms all through his life. In a deep sense, the Psalms are really his songbook. This is his spiritual journal that he takes up and he prays before God. And he prays out these anguished psalms. The night before Jesus dies, he says to his friends, I am overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Which is actually a quotation from Psalm 88, the one that I read out. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Talks about Jesus sweating blood as he contemplates the anguish of the cross, the hell that he's going to take on for you and me. Jesus really does climb down into the pit, and he says, me too. Whatever you've struggled with, Jesus has in principle struggled with exactly the same thing. He has walked through the valley of the shadow of death. And Christians in this room will be able to testify that actually, at times in the suffering, we've known Jesus far better than we've known him in our mountaintop experiences. There's a verse in the New Testament, Philippians chapter 3. The Apostle Paul writes, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his suffering, becoming like him in his death. The fellowship of sharing in his suffering. There is a time to know a friend, the Lord Jesus, who has shared that darkness with you. So Christians have this wonderful resource, the friendship of the living God, the friendship of the kind of God who empathizes, who comes alongside and says, me too. But then that final thing, not just the fact of the feelings, not just the friendship, but also the sense of future. Do we have a sense of future? In John's Gospel, Jesus is about to go to his death. And Jesus says in John chapter 14, let me find it. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I go there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. This is the great mission of Jesus. Jesus belongs to that ultimate family of love, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He comes down into our pit. He joins us in our pit. He suffers the darkness on himself, rises up again, and wants to take us to be with him where he is. You know, the most precious word in Psalm 23 is through the valley of the shadow of death. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. There is a way through. Jesus has pioneered that way through. And you don't just have to imagine a sense of future. It's not pie in the sky when you die. It's not some kind of spiritual Novocaine in the ninth dimension. Jesus has pioneered a way through the despair and darkness. He's come out the other side. And at the end of John's Gospel, it's wonderful. We see what the nature of his future is. At the end of John's Gospel, he goes for long country walks with friends. He goes fishing with his mates. It's barbecues on the beach. That's the life, isn't it? It's eternal life, according to Jesus. There is a sense of future, true and genuine sense of future that we can cling on to through all these storms. It won't take away the darkness. It still is through the valley of the shadow of death. But through that there is mountaintop feasting. There is hope. Put so well by Tolkien as he puts these words onto the lips of Samwise Gamgee as he is comforting Frodo through his dark time. At the end of the Two Towers, he says, "It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come. And when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer." That's true. That is true. And if you put your hand into Jesus' hand, you will find not only a friend, you will also find a sense of future. Should we just be quiet for a second? Shall I just offer a prayer? You might not be used to praying, that's okay. But maybe you could just be quiet and just bring your thoughts to mind, perhaps bring your thoughts to God's. And just allow me to offer a prayer that perhaps we could all find comfort in whatever dark times we're walking through. Shall I pray? Our Father, it is through the valley of the shadow of death that we must walk. And it really is dark. There really is despair. But Father, thank you for a friend in Jesus. Thank you that he has climbed down. Thank you that we can know him in the midst of sorrow. And I pray that each of us would know what it is to have fellowship with your Son in suffering. And I pray also we would know what it is to have a sense of future, a hope. Because Jesus has died on that cross. He has taken our spiritual darkness on himself. He has taken our sins on himself. And he's risen again to offer us new life. Pray that each of us would put our hand into his hand and to know his future, his leading, and his love. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.